you, my holy sisters and brothers. That was Shlomo Katz singing his song, Biglal Avos. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do some beautiful learning? Big Daf, big page. On a Monday night, Melissa in Great Neck, Yehud in South Carolina, Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Paula in Chicago, Gwen in Michigan, Patrice in Utah, Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy, North Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in Pennsylvania, James in Indianapolis, John in Sedona, Paula says Shalom, Renee in Indiana, Shandora in the Bronx, Sandy in Michigan, and Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Susan Rose Golbin in honor of Rabbi Judy Greenfield, who just performed my bat mitzvah. This was my 70th birthday present to myself. Mazel tov, Susan. What a wonderful thing. And may you live to 120 and beyond and read Torah and just, be a blessing to your congregation and to your rabbi. May you be showered in blessings, and we say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Where are we holding? This is Daf Yud Beis, page 12, here in Tractate Moed Katan, the 12th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of the intermediate days of the festivals. What is permitted, what is not. What is the relationship between the laws of what's permitted on the intermediate days to the laws of a mourner? We are getting into that in the last few days. Because most work is not permitted to the mourner during those first 7 days of his mourning, the Shiva period. We pick this up right at the top of 12a. We are in chapter 2 and continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 1, and we'll get into Mishnah number 2 tonight. Shmuel said, with regard to Gentile contractors, who are paid for the completed job rather than by the day, it is prohibited for them to work for a Jew within the boundaries of the Shabbos limit on a day that it is prohibited for the Jew to work. Why? Because it looks like the Jew assigned work for them to do on that day, even though they in fact make their own schedule. Outside the Shabbos limit, where Jews will not see the work being done, it is permitted. What's going on here? So the general principle that we've uncovered regarding work to be done on the intermediate days of the festival, where more activities are permitted than on a festival or even or on a Shabbos, is that you can only do work if it's going to prevent you from undergoing a significant financial loss. And even to prevent a loss, you can only do work that's not going to involve excessive exertion. Now, work that you are not permitted to do yourself, you can't ask a non-Jew to do it for you. What's going on here is the case of, what if you had a contract with a non-Jew that he was going to do work for you, but you weren't paying him by the hour, you weren't paying him by the unit, you just had an overall contract. And it suits the non-Jew to work on that particular day. He's not restricted by the festival. It's not his festival. He doesn't celebrate that festival. He's not Jewish. He works on that day, and there's no reason why he shouldn't work on that day. And it suits his schedule to do the work when it happens to be the festival for you. But the issue is the appearance of impropriety, right? Even though he's going to do it on his own schedule, you have to ask him not to do work on your property or anywhere where that work is going to be visibly associated with you, because you're not allowed to do work on that day. And others may come by and think that you didn't care about the law, or you didn't know about the law, that you were ignorant, or that you're just flouting the law. And though you yourself aren't doing the work, you've hired a non-Jew to do that work for you. All of this not permitted. Unless the non-Jew, he can do work for you because it's on his schedule, right? If he's checked with you what's good for you, well then no, you ask him not to do it. If it's on his schedule, he's just going to deliver you finished goods when the contract is over. And he's going to do that on his own premises, right? He's got his own factory and he's just running an order for you. Sure, he can do that all day long. That's his schedule, not yours. But if he's a contractor building a house for you, so people can see that he's working on your property, that's not going to be permitted on the intermediate days. If you're building some kind of a country house in the mountains, outside the Shabbos limit of the town, so even on the festival, like people aren't going to be there, fellow Jews aren't going to be there, no one's aware that this guy's doing work for you, okay, then he arranged to do that on his schedule, he could do that. If he checks with you, then you would say to him, no, don't do that work for me. But if he's going to go do work, on his schedule in a place where it's not going to be seen by other Jews, okay, so that's not so bad. We're going to see over and over again on this page where there's a lot of cases, there's a lot of gray areas and where this appearance of impropriety really becomes a factor. Rav Papa said, and even outside the Shabbos limit, we said only that it is permissible to let them work when there is no other city in close proximity to there. But if there's another city in close proximity to there, it is prohibited. So the Jews of your town won't be over there and they won't see this work being done for you, but Jews of another town will, and they will associate that property with you, see a non-Jew doing work on your behalf, and it looks like you're flouting the law. Rav Misharshias said, and even when there is no other city in close proximity, we said that it is permissible for Gentile contractors to work for a Jew only on Shabbos and festivals when Jewish people do not routinely go there, i.e. to the place where the work is being performed. However, on the intermediate days of a festival, when Jewish people routinely come and go from there because they're not bound by the Shabbos limit of 2,000 cubits, and then they might see the work being done, and therefore it is prohibited. Right? So the general principle, intermediate days of the festival, we don't do any constructive work and don't have it done for you, even by a non-Jew, even who's being paid an overall rate, not some kind of hourly or daily rate. Even so, you shouldn't have it done. And the Gemara relates about Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, that Gentile contractors built a mansion for him outside the Shabbos limit. And Rav Safra and Rav Huna Bar Chanana happened to come there, but they did not enter it because it had been built on Shabbos in a prohibited manner. The contractor, who had an overall deal with Mar Zutra, was working on Shabbos, which he shouldn't have done, or Mar Zutra shouldn't have allowed that to happen. Mar Zutra knew the law. He didn't permit the contractor to do that work for him. They just had a deal, please build the house. And later, maybe even Mar Zutra told him don't work on Shabbos, but the guy did work on Shabbos. Now, if you told him not to work on Shabbos and he worked on Shabbos anyway, then you're actually absolved of responsibility. You did what you were supposed to do. But for a prominent individual like Mar Zutra, the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia, and where people saw that the house was being worked on Shabbos, it became a problem, and other sages wouldn't go in there. And some even say that Mar Zutra himself wouldn't enter that house that he had built for himself. And the Gemara asks, but didn't Shmuel say, with regard to Gentile contractors, within the boundaries of the Shabbos limit, it is prohibited to let them work on Shabbos, but outside the Shabbos limit, it is prohibited? The Gemara answers, an important person is different and must have a stricter manner. And there are those who say he provided them with assistance, with straw for making the bricks. Consequently, they were not fully independent contractors, and therefore it was prohibited for them to work for him on Shabbos, even outside the Shabbos limit where others might observe it. And the Gemara relates that Rav Chama permitted the bath attendants of the exilarch's house to work for them, i.e. the exilarch and his household, on the intermediate days of the festival. And he said an explanation of this leniency, since they do not take payment for working during the week of the festival, they are merely conferring a favor on the exilarch. Therefore, it is not viewed as actual labor, and we have no problem with it. So before I go on, where did the law end up on this discussion? Gentile contractors. If a Jew gives a Gentile a contract, gives a Gentile contract work, right? Not hourly work, not piecemeal work, but an overall contract to build his house or to work his field. If the work is performed in the city or within the Shabbos limit, the Jew must not allow the Gentile to perform it on Shabbos, lest those who see suspect him of misconduct, not knowing that it is contract work. Even if his neighbors are all Gentiles, it is prohibited due to the concern that Jewish passersby or the members of his own household will misinterpret the situation. If the work is done beyond the Shabbos limit and there's no other city nearby in which Jews dwell, he need not prevent the Gentile from working on Shabbos. With regard to the intermediate days of the festival, it is prohibited to allow a Gentile who was contracted to build a house for a Jew to work on the intermediate days of the festival, even if the house is beyond the Shabbos limit, in accordance with the ruling of Rev Misharshia. If a house was built in this prohibited manner, it is permissible to enter the house. There is no obligation to prevent Gentiles from doing contract work in the privacy of their own homes, on their own premises, in their own factory. But where it's visible that it's being done for you on your property, you have to ask him not to do it. The sages taught in a baraisa, Gentiles may receive contract work on the intermediate days of a festival in order to execute the work after the festival. But, right, so you can make the deal on the intermediate days, but it is prohibited to execute it during the festival week itself. The principle of the matter, any action that a Jew may perform himself, he may tell a Gentile to perform. And any action that he may not perform himself, he may not tell a Gentile to perform it. And it is taught in another baraisa, a Gentile may receive contract work on the intermediate days of a festival in order to execute it after the festival, provided that he does not measure, weigh, or count in order to plan the work in the same manner that he would on an ordinary weekday. You can agree that this work is going to be done, but you can't get into the nitty-gritty of that negotiation during the intermediate days of the festival. The sages taught in a baraisa, one may not breed an animal, i.e. coax or compel a male to mate with a female on the intermediate days of a festival, as this is similar to prohibited labor. Similarly, one may not breed a firstborn animal, nor an unfit consecrated animal. It is prohibited to ever work these animals because of their sanctified status, the firstborn male of a particular female, nor a consecrated animal, right? That's been consecrated to be sacrificed in the temple. They may never be worked. It is prohibited to ever work these animals because of their sanctified status, and breeding them, which is not working them, resembles working them, and so you don't do that during the festival. It is taught in another baraisa, one may not breed an animal on the intermediate days of a festival. And Rabbi Yehuda says, if a she-donkey yearns for a mate because she is in heat, so then one may breed her with a male, lest she cool off, i.e. lest her estrus cycle pass without her mating, which will cause a significant loss. With regard to all other animals that are in heat, they are merely brought into corrals in which there are males, there being no need for further human intervention. It's interesting, I guess humans do need to intervene to breed donkeys. I don't know why. I assume that donkeys were able to do this on their own before humans got involved. But for whatever reason, to prevent the financial loss, you do not bring these donkeys near each other. I mean, you can do it with donkeys. Other animals, you just let them be in the same space. The sages taught, but the point is that's to prevent a significant loss. The sages taught in a baraisa, one may not enclose livestock in particular areas of a field in order to fertilize that area with the manure of this livestock. You can't do that on Shabbos or on festivals or on the intermediate days of a festival. But if the animals came on their own into the field, it is permitted, and he need not remove them, although he benefits from their manure. Right? We don't do farm work on the intermediate days unless it's to prevent a significant loss. Are we preventing a significant loss by letting, a flock of sheep go into a certain field where their manure is going to fertilize the field? No, that can wait. Like that's the sort of thing that can wait. We don't have to get those sheep pooping on the field in these particular days, so that's going to be prohibited. And the sages taught, and the Baraisa continues, and one may not assist Gentile shepherds in pasturing their sheep in our field so that it will be, right? And one may not assist Gentile shepherds in pasturing their sheep in the Jews' field so that it will be fertilized, nor may one provide them with a shepherd to help herd their sheep all around the field so that it is completely fertilized. If the Gentile shepherds were hired by the week, by the month, by the year, or by the septennial period, i.e. for a whole 7 years of one sabbatical cycle, one may assist them and provide them with a shepherd to herd their sheep. Since they were hired for an extended period of time, it is not as though the Jew hired the Gentile specifically to do this work on Shabbos or the festival. Just part of their overall work that they do, so then we allow it. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, on Shabbos, one may have the Gentile pasture the sheep in one's field as a favor in order to earn one's good graces, but not for pay. You can't hire them and pay them to do that for you. On a festival, it is permitted even in exchange for food. You can give the Gentile food in order for him to bring his sheep into your field. And on the intermediate days of the festival, it is even permitted for pay. Rav Yosef said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 2. Mishnah number 2. And similarly, with regard to one whose wine was already, so Mishnah number 1 was about the idea that somebody is an olive oil farmer, right? He grows olives for the purposes of making olive oil. And the issue was that in the midst of that process of harvesting the olives and getting them to the olive press, something happened. The festival started, or he became a mourner and he was not able to complete the process. Can it be continued during the intermediate days? Now we're going to ask a similar question about a vintner, somebody who grows grapes to make wine. So, and similarly, with regard to one whose wine was already in the collection pit beside the wine press, and it needed to be removed lest it sour, right? Significant loss. And mourning for some close relative or some other unavoidable accident befell this person, or his workers misled him, promising to come but failing to do so. During the intermediate days of the festival, he may draw off the wine and complete the process and then plug each barrel of wine in its usual manner. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yosef, whom the law follows. Rabbi Yehuda says he could construct a wooden panel to cover the collection pit so that the wine will not sour. Rabbi Yehuda would prefer that rather than get involved in all this labor during the intermediate days, he just takes some stopgap measures to prevent the financial loss, but not complete the process of finishing the wine. But Rabbi Yosef says, once you get involved in doing labor to prevent a significant financial loss, you can do all the steps of that labor. That's the Mishnah. Gemara. The Gemara comments, and both this Mishnah and the previous one about the olive press are necessary. Even though they seem to be teaching the same lesson, both Mishnahs were necessary, as if the Tana of the Mishnah teaches us only the first Mishnah. One might say that only in that case does Rabbi Yosef say that one is permitted to complete the process, because in the case of oil, the potential loss is considerable. However, in the case of wine, where the loss is not as considerable, one might say that he concedes to Rabbi Yehuda that must be done in an altered manner. And if he teaches us only the last Mishnah, one might say that only in that case involving the wine did Rabbi Yehuda say that one must be stringent. But in the other case involving oil, one might say that he concedes to Rabbi Yosef that and is lenient. Therefore, it is necessary to teach both cases. Now, Sharon asked yesterday, I think it was Sharon, how do we define significant loss? At what point is it a significant loss? If it's just a small loss, maybe we should be stringent and not allow any work. But if it's a big loss, then we're more lenient and allow him to do this work. Well, what is the measure? The sages are usually so precise in seeking, what is that minimum measure to be considered a significant loss that's going to allow this leniency to do work during the intermediate days? When does that kick in? Well, maybe we're going to get a little bit closer to that understanding today. Rav Yitzchak bar Abba said, who is the Tana who teaches that labor performed during the intermediate days of the festival must be performed in an altered fashion, even with regard to a matter that, if unattended, will result in significant loss? That ruling is not in accordance with Rabbi Yosei, as Rabbi Yosei permits one to perform labor that will prevent such a loss, even in its usual manner, doing the labor in its usual manner. Rav Yosef said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, and it is permitted in cases of loss to perform the labor in the usual manner. It would seem like Rabbi Yehuda is the one who would say, well, if you're going to do some labor, do it in an unusual manner. Like, make a shinui, make some kind of a change in the way you do that labor, maybe even do the minimum amount of labor to prevent the loss. That might be an altered manner. Or perform the same labor, but in a way that's obvious to others that you're doing it in this altered manner out of respect for the festival. And the students asked of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, what is the law with regard to sealing a barrel of beer during the intermediate days of the festival? If it is not properly sealed, the beer will leak out through the sides of the barrel. And he said to them, Sinai said. When he says Sinai said, that's a nickname for Rav Yosef, right? Rav Yosef was an Amora in Babylonia, third generation Amora, who was just known to have this incredible memory. All the oral law prior to that, all the Mishnas, all the Baraisas, he was just an absolute expert in knowing the whole law. The interesting thing about Rav Yosef is that later in life, it might have been that he had some kind of memory issues. Perhaps it was some kind of Alzheimer's or something like that, or just some other condition, but it caused him to forget much of his learning, which is so difficult for him. Rav Yosef, who was famous for having the best memory in town, as it were, lost much of it, and then his students would remind him what he had taught them. At any rate, when we talk about Sinai, this is Rav Yosef, as opposed to his learning partner, Rabbah, who was known as the uprooter of mountains, right? Because Rabbah had a very keen intellect, and his analysis was so penetrating that it could even overturn established teachings with a new understanding. At any rate, so Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to them, well, Sinai, meaning Rav Yosef, said, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei. Once you're going to prevent a significant loss, you could do it in a usual manner, even with sealing barrels of beer. And they asked, well, say that Rabbi Yosei said that one may be lenient about wine. And we know he was lenient about olive oil, which is a significant loss. But about beer, does he say the same thing? Beer is much cheaper than wine, and the loss would be much less significant. So now, Sharon, we've got three levels, right? Olive oil, major loss if you don't do that work. Wine, a kind of medium level loss. Beer, not such a significant loss. I mean, unless, unless you're a beer maker and we're talking about, a whole factory full of beer. But it seems like in this context, the amount of beer being made, if you didn't do it, and in fact, what's going on here is not that all the beer would be ruined, but rather that if you didn't plug the barrels properly, some of the beer would be lost by leaking through the barrel. So that's a much lower level loss than all of the oil being ruined or all of the wine being spoiled, or some of the wine being spoiled. Here, this seems to be a very low level of loss, and yet it's likened to a significant level of loss, and Rabbi Yosei is permitting it. And the Gemara explains why no distinction should be made. With regard to wine, what is the reason that Rabbi Yosei was lenient? It is because the loss involved is considerable. With beer as well, there is a loss if the barrel is not properly sealed. As Abaye said, my foster mother told me it is better to have a barrel of 6 sa that is sealed than a barrel of 8 sa that is not sealed, as in the end, more beer will remain in the smaller sealed barrel than in the larger unsealed one. Rav Chama bar Guria said that Rav said, the laws relating to the intermediate days of a festival resemble the laws relating to the Samaritans in the law. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what aspect of the law are they similar? The laws of intermediate days of festivals similar to the laws regarding Samaritans. How are they similar? And Rav Daniel bar Katina said that Rav said he meant to convey that they are sterile, and one may not learn further laws by extrapolation one from one another in both of these areas of the law. Meaning, the laws of the intermediate days of the festivals are very special, and that's why we're having a little bit of trouble defining exactly when is a significant law significant enough, what exactly is effort that's enough of an exertion, when is something serving a public need, and therefore it's going to be allowed even though there's not a significant loss involved, etc. And these are policy considerations, and it's just an area of the law that sort of evolved among the sages in particular ways that we're not going to be able to learn out from that and apply it to the laws of Shabbos or the laws of festival days themselves or to other areas of the law. This particular body of law. Likewise, the law of the Samaritans. Who were the Samaritans? The Samaritans were these people that were brought in by the Assyrians, I believe, when they conquered the northern kingdom. And then that's when the tribes, the lost tribes of Israel, the other 10 tribes were lost, were taken away. And replaced by these people, the Samaritans. The Samaritans found that they were living in the land of Israel during the exalted time of the land of Israel, when the temple was standing, even the first temple was standing. And so the land was not happy with them living there and worshiping idols. They were being attacked by lions and whatnot. So they converted to Judaism, but it was a kind of conversion under duress. They wouldn't have converted if the land itself didn't seem to be repelling them as idolaters. So having become Jews, they didn't practice Judaism with a whole heart. In certain practices, like their observance was not the same as the rest of the Jewish nation. In particular, they accepted the written law of the Torah, but not the oral tradition, which began with Moses at Mount Sinai and was sort of continued by the judges and then the prophets and eventually the sages. But they rejected the oral tradition, and that made their observance of various practices suspect. And that's why, when dealing with Samaritans and whether we listen to Samaritans or not, there's a body of law about that. But it's particular to that group and doesn't extend to other groups. The Gemara offers an example. For instance, Shmuel said, one may seal a jug with pitch, but one may not seal a barrel with pitch on the intermediate days of a festival. And Rav Dimi from Nehardea said, one may seal a barrel with pitch, but one may not seal a small jug with pitch. And their reasoning is as follows. This sage, Rav Dimi, was more concerned about possible financial loss, and so he permitted sealing the larger vessel, for which the potential for loss is great, but not the smaller one. And this sage, Shmuel, was concerned about unnecessary exertion on the festival, and therefore he permitted sealing the smaller vessel, which requires less effort, but not the larger vessel. Right? So you can see, these different considerations are in play. They're going to, I guess sealing with pitch requires quite a lot of work. So one of them is going to allow the larger barrel to be sealed with that because there's a greater loss if the barrel leaks. And the other one is only going to allow the smaller vessel to be sealed with pitch because it takes less work to seal that smaller vessel. Abaye stated a different principle. We have a tradition that the laws of the intermediate days of a festival are like the laws of Shabbos. Now we're on the B side of page 12. And some of the actions for which one is exempt by Torah law are nevertheless prohibited, and some of them are permitted ab initio. So again, some resemblances between the laws of the intermediate days and the laws of Shabbos, but that's all we've learned, that there's some resemblance. The Gemara relates that Rav Huna had his crop harvested for him on the intermediate days of a festival. must be that he was concerned about a significant potential loss if that crop was not harvested, because generally no farm work may be done on the intermediate days unless it's to prevent a significant loss and without excessive exertion. So Rav Huna had his crop harvested. Rabba bar Rav Huna raised an objection to his father, Rav Huna, from a baraisa. The baraisa teaches one may grind flour on the intermediate days of a festival for the sake of the festival, right? You can grind flour because you're going to need to bake from that flour during the festival. But if it is not for the sake of the festival, it is prohibited to grind flour. Now, with regard to a matter that, if unattended, will result in significant loss on the festival, it is permitted to perform labor to prevent that loss on the intermediate days of the festival. For a matter that will not result in a loss if unattended during the intermediate days, it is prohibited to perform the labor. We're just stating the baraisa that Rav Huna's son is using to object to his father. So the baraisa continues, in what case is this statement said that you can do for the needs of the festival and to prevent significant loss? In the case of crops that are already detached from the ground. But in the case of crops that are still attached to the ground, even if all will be lost, labor is prohibited during the intermediate days of the festival. So, Dad, how could you be having people harvest your crop for you? And if one does not have anything to eat, okay, then he may reap and bind sheaves and thresh and winnow the grain in the wind and separate the grain from the chaff and grind the grain into flour, provided that he does not thresh with cows, the way that threshing is performed on an ordinary weekday. But Rav Huna, Dad, who certainly has enough to eat, it's not that if you don't reap your grain, if you don't harvest your grain, you won't have food to eat on the festival. There's no exception that covers you reaping your grain during the intermediate days of the festival. There's no exception within this baraisa that allows you to do what you did. How could you do that? Rav Huna said to his son, the opinion expressed in this unattributed baraisa is an individual opinion, and we do not hold in accordance with this individual opinion. As it is taught in a different baraisa, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel stated a principle in the name of Rabbi Yosei. Now, when Rabbi Yosei debates a law with any other individual, we follow Rabbi Yosei. But when it's Rabbi Yosei against the majority, we follow the majority. So what we just heard in that baraisa was actually the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the individual, and he ended up being overruled by the majority of the rabbis. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel stated a principle in the name of Rabbi Yosei. It is in the case of an item that is already detached from the ground, even if only a portion of it will be lost by not working during the festival, it is permitted to perform labor to prevent the loss. Whereas for crops that are still attached to the ground, even if all of them will be lost, it is prohibited to perform a labor for them. The opinion that all labor is prohibited for crops that have not yet been harvested is the opinion of an individual authority, Rabbi Yosei, and the majority of the rabbis disagree. And that's why the law enabled Rav Huna to have his crops harvested to prevent the loss, even though it meant doing work with crops that are still attached to the ground. And the Gemara asks, but if the unattributed baraisa reflects the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, and it is permitted to work when one has nothing to eat, well, then let him thresh even with cows. Why did that unattributed baraisa say that, okay, if you need it to eat, you need it for the festival, then, okay, you can harvest the grain and go through all the steps of processing that into flour, including threshing. But if you do thresh it, you shouldn't do that with cows, right? You can thresh enough wheat without big animals threshing it for you to get what you need for the needs of the festival. But Rabbi Yosei said, once you're doing something, right, to prevent loss or for the needs of the festival, once it's permitted, then you can do it in its regular manner. Rabbi Yosei is the one who said you don't have to alter it. Once it becomes permitted, all the steps are permissible. So why is it that you shouldn't thresh with cows? Right. So if it's in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, and he doesn't require altering the manner in which one performs the labor, then why does it say that you can thresh but not with cows? Well, the Gemara rejects this argument. Rabbi Yosef could have said to you, here too, since one does not always thresh with cows, threshing without them now on the intermediate days of the festival is also not considered threshing in an altered manner. Sometimes you thresh with cows, sometimes you don't thresh with cows. It's not that threshing without cows is altering the manner that you would normally do it. The reason I'm telling you there's various means available to do it, and one of them is threshing without cows, and you should do it without cows. Why? Because one must, is not because one must perform labor in an altered manner, but rather in order to avoid attracting public attention to the fact that you are working during the festival week. It might be permitted to avoid significant loss. It might be permitted because it serves a public need. But you should still do it somewhat quietly. Don't draw attention to it. So if there's various normal ways to do it, don't do the one that's going to attract a lot of attention. And the sages taught in a baraisa, one may grind flour on the intermediate days of a festival for the sake of the festival. But if it is not for the sake of the festival, it is prohibited. And if he ground and left some flour over, it is permitted for use after the festival. Similarly, one may cut down trees on the intermediate days of the festival only for the sake of the festival. But if it is not for the sake of the festival, it is prohibited. But if he did it for the sake of the festival and he cut down more than he needed, do the excess trees, the ones he didn't need for the sake of the festival, do they now become prohibited? Right? If you are doing work that's not for the sake of the festival and you do it during the festival, then the product of that labor is going to become prohibited for use. So what about where you're doing something for the sake of the festival, but now that you started, you do more than what you need for the sake of the festival? Is the extra also prohibited for use? No. Once you got the permit to do something for the needs of the festival, you shouldn't do more than that. But if you did, it's going to be permissible to use that after the festival. And the example is given in terms of cutting down trees. Then another example, one may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival for the sake of the festival. But if it is not for the sake of the festival, it's prohibited. And if he brewed beer for the sake of the festival and he brewed more than he needed and there's some left over, so then it is permitted to use that beer after the festival, provided that he does not employ artifice, exploiting the allowance to work on a festival by knowingly making more than was needed. Right? You can't say, okay, well, now that I got my permit to work on the festival, I only need, like 1 barrel of beer, but I'll brew 100 barrels just because, there's a lot of labor around here. That's all these people can't do work on their own stuff because it's the intermediate days. I got the permit to brew beer because we need it for the festival. All these people are sitting around. Come on, let's brew 100 barrels. That's artifice, and then you won't be able to use those extra 99 barrels. But if you just got going and you realize only later you realize you only needed 1 barrel, but you made 3, fine. The extra 2, you're going to be permitted to use them after the festival. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a baraisa. Wait, what about this idea that you can't use artifice? One may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival for the sake of the festival, but if it is not for the sake of the festival, it is prohibited. This applies both to date beer and barley beer. And even though he has old beer, he may employ an artifice and drink from the new beer, i.e., he may say he prefers new beer and brew a new batch, even though he has enough old beer for the festival. Now, this statement contradicts the previous baraisa that prohibited circumventing the prohibition against labor through artifice. And the Gemara answers, this matter is a dispute between Tanaim. As it is taught in a baraisa, one may not employ an artifice in this regard, i.e., to circumvent the prohibition against labor during the intermediate days of the festival. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda says, one may employ an artifice. There's going to be a limit to how much artifice you can employ, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. But this idea that, well, you have old beer sitting around, but you prefer new beer, you could say, I prefer new beer. Let's make a new batch. I don't know why that's artifice, unless maybe you would have been okay with the old beer, but this is going to give you a permit to brew the new beer. But again, you can only brew more or less how much you need for the festival, not like a huge amount beyond that. The Gemara relates that Rav had his crop harvested on the intermediate days of a festival. Shmuel heard about this and was dismayed. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that Shmuel holds in accordance with the individual opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who prohibits all labor for crops that are attached to the ground, even if inattention will result in significant loss? And the Gemara answers, no, it was a crop of wheat, which would not have been ruined had the harvest been pushed off a week, and therefore Shmuel was offended. So it wasn't to avoid significant loss, then why was Rav doing it? And the Gemara asks, well, what is the reason that Rav acted in this manner? And the Gemara answers, Rav is in the category of one who does not have anything to eat. He had to harvest the wheat, or he wouldn't have had what to make. He wouldn't have had flour to make bread for the needs of the festival. That's why he harvested his wheat. And the Gemara asks, well, in that case, why did Shmuel disapprove? And the Gemara explains, the people who reported Rav's actions to Shmuel did not complete the story for him. Alternatively, an important person such as Rav is different, and Shmuel thought that Rav should have been stringent with himself even in his difficult circumstances. So 2 reasons given. Rav shouldn't have harvested, according to Shmuel, because Shmuel didn't realize that Rav needed the flour to eat it during the festival. Second reason, Shmuel thought, well, Rav, even if he needs the flour, he should find some other way to get it than cutting down his wheat, because people will look at him, see, hey, Rav is harvesting wheat. It must be that it's permitted to harvest wheat. They wouldn't think to themselves, if he doesn't harvest that wheat, he won't have flour, he won't have bread. Important principle, though, Shmuel, if it was the first reason that Shmuel was judging him without all the facts, don't judge a person until you walk in their shoes. Don't judge a person until you have the whole story. It was further related that Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah once went out on Shabbos with a coral seal on his ring and drank water heated by a Gentile cook. These are totally separate issues, right? A coral seal, so this is a particular ring, a seal, right, that you would use to ratify contracts, right, like a little wax, and you would put the seal in it. So that is a utensil that should be muktzah on Shabbos, right? Something that you use for ratifying deals and documents. You shouldn't be touching it on Shabbos. If it's in the form of a ring, can you wear that ring? If it is an adornment. If it's made out of coral, not silver or gold, is it truly an adornment? That was an issue that we encountered back in Tractate Shabbos. So here, right, so Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah, did this, and then so he did these 2 things. He wore the coral seal on his ring, and he drank water that was heated by a Gentile cook. That's not on Shabbos. But the issue here is an observant Jew cannot eat food that is made by a non-Jew. Rabbi Ami heard about this and was dismayed about both things. And Rav Yosef said, what is the reason that he was dismayed? If it was because of the coral seal, isn't it taught in a baraisa, bracelets, nose rings, and rings are like all other utensils, and they may be carried in a courtyard. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah's action conformed to halacha. And if Rabbi Ami was dismayed because Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah drank water heated by a Gentile cook, didn't Shmuel bar Yitzhak say that Rav said, with regard to anything that is eaten raw, like water, even if it was heated by a Gentile, it is not subject to the prohibition against eating food cooked by Gentiles. And the Gemara resolves both difficulties. An important person is different, and Rabbi Ami believed that Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah should have been more stringent with himself. What is the law about food cooked by Gentiles? Only foods that are important enough to be served at a king's table and that are not eaten raw are subject to the prohibition against eating food cooked by Gentiles. The determination of what is considered fit for a king's table depends upon the time and place. This rabbinic decree applies even when it is certain that the food contains only kosher ingredients. Can non-Jews work in the kitchen of a kosher restaurant? Of course they can. But they're being supervised by mashpiach, right? What's that word again? But they're being supervised by the kosher supervisor of that restaurant. Let's go on. Rav Hananel said that Rav said, a person may chop down a palm tree on the intermediate days of a festival, although he needs only its sawdust. And the Gemara comments, so he needs it for the festival. He needs sawdust for some reason for the festival. So can he chop down a tree? It's for the festival. So this is not about avoiding significant loss. This is for the needs of the festival. So now the law is, if he needs the sawdust for the festival, okay, so he can even chop down a tree. And the Gemara comments, Abaye cursed it, i.e. the behavior of one who exerts such effort on the festival for so small a need, Abaye disapproved. So we can see with the laws of what's permitted on the intermediate days of the festival, even the sages themselves had trouble defining what's allowed and what's not. And the Gemara relates that Rav Ashi had a forest in Shalania, and he went to cut it down on the intermediate days of the festival. Rav Shela from Shalania said to Rav Ashi, what is your opinion about what you are doing? Do you rely on that which Rav Hananel said that Rav said? A person may chop down a palm tree on the intermediate days of a festival, even though he needs only its sawdust? Didn't Abaye curse such behavior? Rav Ashi said to him, oh, I did not hear that Abaye said that. That is to say, in a delicate way, I do not hold in accordance with Abaye. And the iron of Rav Ashi's axe then slipped and was about to cut off his leg. He left it, ceasing his chopping, and came back again to chop down the forest only after the festival. Right? So he didn't hold by this, he held by like Rav, not like Abaye. But then when he had a mishap, he thought, well, maybe Abaye's right. And so even though it's permitted for me to chop down this forest because some of what I need from this forest is for the festival, it's a little bit too much like excessive exertion beyond the needs of the festival. I better hold like Abaye. The Gemara relates that I'm almost done, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. And the Gemara relates that Rav Yehuda permitted uprooting flax, cutting hops, and uprooting sesame plants on the intermediate days of the festival. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, granted, this is reasonable in the case of flax, which is suitable for use as a cover for various objects and therefore has a use even during the festival. And so too hops, which are suitable for making beer. But for what are sesame plants suitable? Since the sesame seeds require a long drying period before oil can be extracted from them to make sesame oil. Rav Yosef said to him, well, they are suitable for the seeds, and they can be, which can be consumed immediately. He's like, don't you ever eat sesame seeds? We eat sesame seeds, so therefore we can harvest these seeds, or we can process them since it's for the festival. It was further mentioned that Rabbi Yanai, an uprooting, uprooting flax, cutting hops, and uprooting sesame plants. So it's like you're taking it out of the ground, but it's because you're going to eat it on the festival. So it was further mentioned that Rabbi Yanai had an orchard whose time for harvesting the fruit arrived during the intermediate days of the festival. So he harvested it during the festival, as the fruit would otherwise have spoiled, avoiding a significant loss. The following year, everyone delayed the harvest of their orchards until the intermediate days of the festival. And Rabbi Yanai declared the earnings from his orchard ownerless that year. He gave up all profit from his own orchard because he realized that his behavior of harvesting the fruit, which happened to come ripe right during the intermediate days, and so to avoid the significant loss, he harvested it. But then because he was a significant person, people saw him harvesting fruit in his own orchard. So the next year they timed it so their orchards would require harvesting during the intermediate days. And it was creating a precedent that was not good. So Rabbi Yanai sacrificed all his own profits to send the clear message, no. If it happens by accident, okay, but we're certainly not going to arrange for it to happen that way in advance. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Tomorrow we'll pick it up with Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 2. All right, let's see if there's any questions. on page 12. Sharon, I have to have others cover my clinic patients when I take off for Jewish holidays. Is that a no-no? Well, first of all, I mean, you're telling me that this is a clinic, like a health clinic. So, if people's treatment is going, if losing that treatment is going to endanger them, so that would seem like a pikuach nefesh type of situation. Even in terms of mental health, as we've seen in the last 2 years, mental health issues can become very serious indeed. Otherwise, if the work can wait, it's a different question. What I would say to you, Sharon, is we can't paskin halacha from the Gemara. Very difficult to take what we're reading here and extend it to your situation without a deeper dive into what you're doing. So my answer is, of course, check with your rabbi. Bill, given that it's prohibited to have a Gentile contractor working for a Jewish client on the intermediate days of the festival, is it illicit to pay the Gentile workers during that period? For example, a certain Gentile construction firm is hired by a pious Jewish client. The client asks that the work not be carried out during the intermediate days. The company asks if it would be accessible to charge the client for those days so that the workers still get their daily wage, since it isn't their fault that work has stopped. Given that this is commerce, is it acceptable for the Jewish client to pay? I assume, as a matter of course, that the Jewish client would be more than willing if it is acceptable, since they have no desire to overly burden their Gentile contractors. Well, first of all, are you asking me, can the money be paid during the festival? Because, if this issue is going to come up, I mean, it could have come up in advance, it could have come up later. I think so the money I think should not be paid during the festival. That's avoidable for sure. Then it's a different question, is like, well, in order for the Gentile who has the contract with the Jew, it's an overall contract, right? So, I'm going to pay you $10,000 to build a shed, right? And when the shed is completed, I'm going to, I'll give you $5,000 now and another $5,000 when the shed is finished. But the contractor expected to keep the work on the shed going even during that week that turns out to be the festival for the Jews. So the Jew says, please don't work during that week. So then the contractor says, okay, well, if I idle my workers, so then now they're suddenly on vacation when they didn't expect to be on vacation. So, we could delay the delivery date of your shed by 1 week, since no work is going to be done during that week. But in terms of my workers, now I'm idling them and they're not getting paid for a week when they need to get paid. Very interesting question. I would have to think more about it, because the Jew might say, well, couldn't they work on something else during that week? And the contractor might say, well, no, we work on one job at a time. So if they don't work on your thing, they're not working at all. Now it's a real problem, and you're not going to allow them to work because it's in your property. They can't do work for you for this contract in some other location. It's a very interesting question. Very interesting question. Adam, I see. One opinion can stand if it is just, but will get corrected by the majority if too strict or lenient. Generally, yeah. Right? Generally, yeah. When the Tanaim were having a lot of these discussions, right? Those are the sages of the Mishna, and many of the laws got worked out. But some issues became thorny later in time, and then the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, who are later, right? The sages of the Mishnah was finished around the year 200 of the Common Era, and then the sages of the Gemara, they're functioning like between the years 200 and 500. Then beyond that, they're later commentators. But many of these laws were fixed by that time. Occasionally, we have something, where the law changed later than that. But generally speaking, people will have, at the time of the Mishnah, then you did have sort of local authorities, like Rabbi Yochanan, where he is the lead authority in his town, and then his town might follow a different set of laws. than Reish Lakish, who is somewhere else, or Rabbi Kiva, who's somewhere else. But that was not a good state of affairs. So they had to work out what the laws were and what the halacha would be for the whole Jewish people. Sometimes it was just, one individual versus another, and then we follow the more prominent one. Sometimes it was an individual versus the majority, and then almost always we're going to follow the majority. And Tom, wouldn't delaying the harvest lead to spoiled fruit? I mean, that is like a farm-specific or orchard-specific question. We're not talking about a big delay, right? It's like a week. And so is delaying it going to cause a significant loss? If yes, then that definitely gets factored into it, and probably we're not going to allow it, right? Okay. That's what I've got for today. With God's help, we'll gather again tomorrow for page 13. Have a great night. We're doing really well, right? I mean, it used to be that a page like this, I would skip stuff because it seemed like we couldn't do the whole daf. But the class is just at a higher level now. So, for quite a while now, we're just doing the whole daf, always doing the whole daf. We'll see how long we can keep that going. But it is definitely my inclination now to just always do the whole page unless there's a strong reason not to. But that's where we've been lately. Have a great night.